The biggest problem that Russia doesn't recognize that it has Ukrainian hostages. We name them hostages, yes, like kidnapped people or captured people, because neither country who is in the war state can't have any civilians captured. So they try not recognize that they have any other people besides prisoners of war. Or they tried somehow through the courts or through the hearings, they tried to recognize all the civilians they captured as somehow connected with Ukrainian army forces or some Ukrainian intelligence.
Hello and welcome back to Covering Ukraine. I'm Antonina Rybka, your host for this 17th episode. Today we are talking about something deeply important and painful. The abduction of Ukrainian civilians by Russian forces in Russia's war against Ukraine. Under international law, taking civilians captive is illegal. Yet there is no official mechanism to bring back those abducted by Russian troops. And this didn't start on 24th of February 2022. Russia has been kidnapping and persecuting civilians in occupied Ukrainian territories since 2014. These abductions are part of wider human rights violations, well documented by international organizations, human rights groups, and Ukrainian authorities. Right now, thousands of Ukrainians are missing or detained. No one knows the exact numbers. Families keep fighting to bring their loved ones home, and international pressure is crucial in holding Russia accountable. To dive deeper into this issue, Hungarian journalist Kornelia Kiss, who is also a media network manager at our Europe-Ukraine desk, spoke with two journalists from our network who worked across borders to investigate it. Alona Savchuk, a freelance journalist from Ukraine, and Robert Putzbach, a journalist at the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, where their articles were published. What stories did they uncover? Which families did they meet? How are those families fighting for the release of their loved ones? And what was it like for Alona and Robert to work on this cross-border media project? Let's listen to their conversation, recorded in October 2024.
Welcome to the next episode of Covering Ukraine podcast. Thank you to journalists Alona Savchuk and Robert Putzbach for accepting our invitation. Alona is a Europe-Ukraine desk fellow, which means that in our project she joined us on our study trips to European Union countries, the aim of which was to help Ukrainian journalists to get to know the media in the European Union countries better and to build contacts there. This was clearly successful as you finally published a joint article in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany on a shocking, sad but very important topic, the Ukrainian civilians kidnapped by the Russians. Could you please just briefly introduce your topic? What do we know about the civilians kidnapped by the Russians? How many could they be?
The biggest problem that Russia doesn't recognize that it has Ukrainian hostages. We name them hostages, yes, like kidnapped people or captured people, because neither country who is in the war state can't have any civilians captured. So they try not recognize that they have any other people besides prisoners of war. Or they tried somehow through the courts or through the hearings, they tried to recognize all the civilians they captured as somehow connected with Ukrainian army forces or some Ukrainian intelligence. For example, I'd like to remind about the very sad news we had yesterday about my colleague, Ukrainian reporter Victoria Roshina, the news that she has died in Russian captivity. So, for example, she was captured a year ago. As I remember, it was August 2023. And Russia doesn't recognize that they have Victoria for almost more than a half a year. I think it was in April this year. Yeah, so her family doesn't know about in what state and where is she for almost like a year. And now we know that she was in Russian captivity all this time and in the Russian CISO. So it's the common thing for Russians. They just capture the civilians and we can't even know this amount of people who are in captivity. So there's some official statements from Ukrainian ombudsman. It's about tens of thousands. But also we know that it's about 16,000 people who are named by name. And we know that this particular person was captured and somehow somewhere in Russia, and they spread all over the country. So it's the biggest problem. We can't even understand the amount of people who are in captivity. Robert, maybe you can add something on this topic too.
I would say that the amount of people is very hard to tell, and there are a few different numbers, and basically every human rights organization is kind of relying on different numbers, but all of them tell that they might be not accurate. Or, for example, for the article, we were speaking with a colleague from Media Initiative for Human Rights, who told us that she thinks that the total amount of civilians abducted by Russians would be 5 to 7 times more than the number which is already in the record, kind of. So I think there are a lot of factors which make it very hard to say, because you have cities. I mean, it is more easy in a city which was under Russian occupation and now it is liberated. So at least part of the people who live there are now in freedom in Ukrainian territory, and they are able to speak to Ukrainian authorities. Also, they have less fear to speak to Ukrainian authorities or human rights defenders or activists or whomever, because they are not under a constant threat. But especially for the territory which is still under Russian occupation, it's a big problem, because people who tell their story or to make it public and they are still in a territory under Russian occupation, this means that something might happen to them and or to their relatives or to relatives which are still living there. So all of these factors makes it very hard to estimate. But as Alona already mentioned, there are like 16,000 civilians missing. And as far as I remember from our article, there's a number of 1,800 civilians where the Ukrainian authorities know exactly their names and everything, and where they are being held or where they were held at least shortly before. Yeah, I would say that it's very hard to estimate, but we can definitely say that it's about thousands of people.
Several families are presented in your article who are searching for their family members and how they are doing it. Can you summarize what happens in such cases? If someone finds out that a family member has been captivated by the Russians, where can they turn? What authorities, what NGOs, how can they find their relative in such cases? Where can they start?
Yeah, I would say this really depends on the situation. I mean, in general, you can reach out to Ukrainian law enforcement. I would say like any kind of agency would feel responsible for that, or at least hand over your case to another agency. Apart from that, you can reach out to Ukrainian NGOs, like, for example, Zmina or MIPL, like this Media Initiative for Human Rights, which I already mentioned, or many others. So you can at least make sure that this case of your relative is known, is not forgotten. And of course, this is also an individual decision, but you can try to make this case widely known, for example, with speaking to media representatives, or to raise awareness to this case and to try to put a lot of pressure to the Russians to make sure that this case is not forgotten. But of course, as I already mentioned, this depends a lot on your personal situation. So if you're, for instance, we had in our article the case of Dmytro Lyuba, who got abducted in Kiev Oblast in the first days of the war. And just a few weeks later, the Russian soldiers were retreating from there and they took him with them. But his parents are still there, still living in their family home. So for them, for instance, it was possible after a very short time to reach out to Ukrainian authorities and to speak to them without the fear that something might happen to them. The only fear was about their son, which is still in Russian captivity. Of course, it gets a lot more tricky if you're speaking about people who are still living under Russian occupation or who have a lot of relatives which are living under Russian occupation.
I'd like to add that in this article, we tried to represent the diversity of cases. So we have Taras Bukreyev, who was captured on the south of Ukraine, and he was transferred to the occupied territories. And he managed somehow to, it was luck or just coincidence, a lot of coincidence. I don't know how we can tell this, but somehow he managed to go home by himself. And we have the case, as Robert told, of Dmytro Chyliuk from the north of Ukraine and in the first days of the war. And it was very difficult for his relatives to track the changes, how Dmytro was just captured and transferred to Russian territory, and how many points or places he changed on this way. And also, family had only one very short piece of paper from the Red Cross that he was alive, and it was months after his capturing. And we had the case of Irina Goroptsova, who is activist from Kherson, and her parents, they know where is she and in which state is she. She was transferred to Crimea very quickly, but also they didn't have any access to her. And they tried to manage this access through the Crimean lawyers who are working there under occupation for years. So we tried to represent how these cases can be difficult and how they can be resolved or not resolved in case of Dmytro Chyliuk and Irina Goroptsova for now. And we tried to show that it's very different for different parts of Ukraine also. And about how the people and families who has some capture member of their family now, what they can do. For now, for months, is working the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war. And they have this joint power of all the law enforcement and human rights enforcement in Ukraine. They include also in their work a lot of human rights defenders organizations. And for now, it's much easier for people somehow to manage and somehow to track record the case of their relative, because they has one particular institution. They can go and ask all the information and all the updates. But as Robert told, at the beginning of war, it was very difficult. And for example, it was very lucky this Kyiv Oblast, who was liberated in a few weeks, and National Police and SBU, they has this opportunity to gather information quickly about Dmytro's case. But in other situations, as in long-term occupation and the long-term occupation, I think it wouldn't be so easy for them.
Yeah, that's true. And also, as an example, I would say every relative in the first place would be very desperate and shocked and try anything they could. So I would say it's hard to answer this question. What should someone do? I think it depends on many factors, and it's every time different. And it can be very desperate. Actually, the parents of Irina Goroptsova, they actually went to Crimea by themselves. Just these two engineers took a bus from Kherson, basically, to search for her just by their own decision, which also can be very risky and difficult. I mean, they were not successful in this part, but I think it shows that almost everyone who gets into this situation is very desperate and is trying anything they can just to make sure that they do anything they can so their relatives can be tracked to find out how they are doing and where they are.
Do you think that publicity helps? Robert mentioned that some families choose to turn to the media. Are there some examples when this kind of publicity putting pressure on Russia had these families to find their relatives or to free them?
I think it's not about freedom for these people, but it's about a little bit of security of their health and their life. For example, I had the experience of working in occupied Crimea for 3 years with political prisoners' cases. And at the first, people were very scared to talk about when their relatives were captured, yes, or were under investigations or something, when they put in CISO, basically. But then they understand that if the world, if any other people in any other parts of Ukraine, Russia and so on, I need to add that it was before the start the full-scale invasion. Now Russia is breaking bad almost awfully. And I don't know if it somehow can influence this media part of the cases. But for that time, it was easier to manage and to know that if about this particular person, about this particular political prisoner, people know, then it's much bigger chances that he would be kept alive and in health and wouldn't be tortured or wouldn't be treated as as not a person, not a human. So for a lot of people, this media part and talking with media, it's not about the freedom of the people, of their relatives, but it's about to keep them safe in any other possible situations. If they can do something, it's one of what they can do.
Yeah, I would agree to that. I would also say that it got much harder or I don't know, maybe there are no real red lines anymore since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Even people which cases are perfectly documented and which are publicly known, as the case of Victoria Roshina shows, even die in Russian captivity. But still, it's the attempt to raise awareness, so make it put any kind of external pressure on them. But it's hard to tell on any individual case the direct impact of that. And of course, for the relatives, there's also or always the hope that at some point there will be a prisoner exchange where their relatives are included. Prisoner exchange is a bit of wrong term in this regard because Ukraine, of course, doesn't hold any Russian civilians in captivity. But even before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were cases where Ukrainian civilians were included in such exchanges. And of course, this is something also relatives and family members are hoping for, because that's just the way to get their loved ones back.
You talked a lot to such people while working on your article. What do you think, where do the family members and friends of captivated civilians find hope? Some parents know that their child, for example, has been sentenced to more than 10 years in prison by the Russians. What do they think will happen in the future?
In terms of this question, I'd like to tell about the parents of Irina Horoptsova. I need to tell that we postponed the publishing of this article because we were waiting for the sentence for her, because a lawyer of Irina Horoptsova told us that if we publish it before the sentence, it can be worse for her. So we just waited for this sentence. And the day it was publicly known, I called the father of Irina Horoptsova, and to be honest, I expected a difficult conversation because it was 13 years sentence, and I know that how they love her much, and it was very difficult for them, and they are people in age. But when I called him, he sounds very relieved, because he knew that it's a first step to releasing of his daughter. He told me, we expected like that because the prosecutor wanted 20 years and they just cut it in half, and it's a normal case for the cases in Crimea. So it's not something unexpected for them. But also he told, so now we can start to trying to release her as a hostage, as a prisoner of war, because she was sentenced now. And for them, it's a part of relief because now she has some she was recognized as a prisoner of war. So now they can start to try to release her about this exchange of prisoners of war. And I think a lot of families thought in these terms. So if they have this sentence, so Russia now is satisfied and they have this presence of face that they are criminals for them, and now they can somehow try to get rid of them and took back their own Russian guys or Russian soldiers.
And I would think one point which also can help families to gain hope or something like that would be the moment when they receive further informations of their loved ones in Russian captivity, which mostly happens after Ukrainian prisoners of war or other civilians, but I would say mainly Ukrainian prisoners of war got released, because they often spend time in the same cells or at least in the same prisons or any kind of buildings which are used as prisons. So this is mostly the moment where relatives can find out about their loved ones. If someone got released from Russian captivity, and he will be questioned by, first of all, Ukrainian law enforcement or special services, but of course also by NGOs. And he will tell with whom he spent time in prison, with whom he was in the prison cell, and of course about the conditions of these people. So this is often the moment where relatives can find out something. If someone is released and he tells, I was in this and that prison in Russia or in so-called DNR or wherever, and I've seen him. So it means he's still alive. And most of the times the condition is not that good because the prisoners are deprived of basic rights and don't get enough food and are tortured and beaten and all of that. But I would still say that this can be a moment of hope if you get any kind of new information, which at least tells you he's there, he's alive. And sometimes they are, or the people in prison are even able to deliver some sort of small messages through released other prisoners.
How is this topic handled by the Ukrainian press? Is this like a top topic that it is written about all the time, or is it something that among the many other consequences of the war does not get as much attention as other issues? How do you see this?
Of course, it's a top topic because it's about our people and it's about civilians. And, each Ukrainian in our country understands that everyone can be on their place. So we are not safe anywhere. Now it's okay. We are I'm living in Kyiv and I understand that it's not, it doesn't under the danger of occupation now. But for example, in the case with Victoria, I worked a lot on the front lines, so I easily can be on her place. Yeah, for example. But the difficulty of highlighting or of publications on this topic is that nothing changes more, because Russians, we had a very big media booth when it was released Nariman Jalal and other civilian hostages the previous time. But besides that, it's not very much news and updates about civilian hostages because Russia tries not to talk about them. So there are no much updates about people there. So sadly, it's mostly this sad news about some people who were died in captivity, or much rarely that about the release of the civilian hostages. But media tried to cover personal stories because what we can tell in general picture, it was published before, a lot of, and now it doesn't worth to repeating themselves. So now media are trying to cover more personal stories than some general picture.
And how much the international press covers this topic? You must have chatted the German press before writing this article for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, maybe it's a bit hard to tell about the international press in general because I try to read as much as possible, but I'm for sure not able to see everything which is published in every media. But to speak about German press, I would say that it is a topic and it is a known topic, but there are other topics which got a bit more attention. For example, abducted children or children which were brought to Russia, because this also led to the arrest warrants for Putin himself from the ICC. So I would say, for example, this topic is a bit more present in German media, or in general topic about prisoners of war, because quite regular will have a prisoner exchange where also sometimes some civilians are included, but mostly prisoners of war. So this is quite regularly a topic, and you can report about it even from far away. So you can just mention this exchange and how many soldiers or defenders returned home. But most of them are not internationally known, which means that even if they are journalists or activists or public figures in Ukraine, they're not necessarily internationally known. So they get maybe not that much attention. But of course, there are some cases which are also in Germany widely known, and I've seen articles about it. If you think about the former mayor of Kherson, for example, Igor Kolikhaev, this would be an example where the case is known and where there are a couple of reports. But I would say we also chose this topic because it could get more attention in international media.
And did you work on similar topics before? Iona already said she had. And you, Robert?
Yes, I would say I also got in contact with this topic, of course, because I regularly travel to Ukraine to report about this war, and not about only the war, but of course about what happens in society and in politics in general in the past 2.5 years, and of course even before. So, of course, I got in contact with this topic, for instance, also maybe a point which influenced me or which made me more curious about this topic, that I met Stanislav Aseev in February, I think, in Donbass, where he served at that time for the Ukrainian armed forces. And before I read his books, where he also described his own time in Russian captivity, which lasted for a long time. And of course, it was before the start of the full-scale invasion. But I would say that this topic existed much longer. And I was able to learn a lot about these harsh conditions to last, but about, which is a system of violence, torture, and total arbitrariness. So I would say I got in contact with the topic before, and I would say that it's always important to tell human stories, to tell personal stories, because even though it's very interesting to find out the real number of Ukrainian civilians in Russian captivity, for the reader, or at least for the German reader, it would be only a number out of many numbers, because you have numbers every day and kill people every day and things like that. Probably just the individual story can raise a bit more or awareness. And I think it also sticks in the head for a longer time. At least that's what I hope.
Iona?
As for me, I always connected with human side of anything happens on the battlefield and about some changes that it brings to society. Always about the frontline communities, and in this case about the occupied and liberated communities. And also, as for me, I choose this topic because it's when you can tell through the personal stories, human stories, tell the bigger picture of the problem that we have and trying to find somehow the solutions, or just maybe not find solutions, but highlight this problem for the society. And the problems like human rights violations is always on my mind when I work with it. I have almost 10 years experience on reporting on the ground, and it's always somehow connected with the human rights. And it's definitely the violations, the biggest violations of a human right, when Russia just captures civilian people from Ukrainian land and just get them to the different parts of Russia and tell their own people that they are criminals and tortures them and doesn't give them space to go home. So for me, it's a very important topic because it's about my people. And when I had the chance to talk to the German audience with Robert's help about this, it wasn't even a question if I want to join this project or not.
Are there any challenges in such a cross-border cooperation between journalists from different countries?
Yeah, there is always a language challenge. So we did it at the end that I wrote my part basically already in German and asked Alona to write her part in English, which is also for her a bit difficult because it's not her native language. So she already has to write in a different language. And at the end, I translated that back into German, included everything, mixed it together, and translated it back to English to be able to send it to her so she can check if everything's correct and if she likes all the connections in the article and what got cut out and what was included. So I would say, of course, the whole process is a bit more difficult compared to a project where we work together and she publishes her own text and I publish my own text, and we just share our time there, or we just do the research together. So I would say if it's in a way that really two journalists from two different countries publish an article together, of course it takes a bit extra effort, also because you check back a lot of times and you need a lot of communication to do that over a long period of time. But I absolutely think that it was worth it and could be a very interesting result. And also the collaboration with Alona were very good, and she was very reliable and precise.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy too with this project together, and grateful for Robert for his offer. Yeah. Yes, as Robert told, I think it's much more about challenges about logistics. So it's as he told that it's about this language barrier. Yeah, because I don't know German, and also English isn't my native language. And when I am writing in Ukrainian, it's a feature writing. So it's much more, I'm trying to do my best to use all the language part when I'm writing in Ukrainian. So when I done it in English, what I accent on, it's about the clarity and about facts, not the beautiful how it was written. Yeah. So for me, it's a bit change. But also I had the previous experience with my other foreign colleagues, and I know that the part I need just to accept, because when we talk about German press, so Robert has an upper hand, and he is a main person because he speaks with editors and he knows how his particular newspaper does this stuff, and I need just follow his lead when I do the same with British media or with Polish media. When I'm working by myself in Ukraine, of course, I'm the main person in the project. But also about logistics, I mean that it can't be as I do it with my colleagues, friends here, just hop on the car and go, yeah? So Robert, he has a long road, so we need to be prepared in advance, and he has limited time, so we need to do a lot and not to spread our time and go and to do very clearly and an exact particular time. And it's always a bit difficult on the ground because work with people is always difficult, yes? Because they have their own plans and they have their own, image of how it can be. But I think we managed good. So I think we were just lucky enough to do all this stuff on the ground in time and as we pictured it in before. But in general, I don't think that it's challenging to work with foreign journalists more than with my own in my country. If a person is a good professional and he has the similar view on what we want to do, it's easy for me to find the common language.
Alona and Robert, thank you very much for this valuable insight. And we hope to read more articles on Ukraine from you very soon.
Thank you too. Thank you for hosting.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. And I also hope that we will produce some more.
Thanks for listening to the 17th episode of Covering Ukraine. I'm Antonina Rybka, project manager at the Europe-Ukraine desk at n-ost. The interview was recorded by Kornelia Kiss, who spoke with Alona Savchuk and Robert Putzbach. This episode was edited, sound designed and mixed by Lyuba Gook. The views shared by our guests are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of the media they work for, nor n-ost or the European Commission, which funded this project. Covering Ukraine is part of the Europe-Ukraine desk, a program that brings together journalists from the EU and Ukraine. If you want to reach out to us, drop us a line at eud@n-ost.org. And if you found this episode important, maybe you would like to share it with a friend. We will be back soon. Until then, take care.